Score LSAT podcast, episode 7. This is John Dinning, sitting in beautiful Napa Valley.
And this is Dave Kaloran, and I'm sitting right across from you for the first time in podcast history.
That's right, yeah, in close proximity, which is probably not the best idea, but it does explain a lot of the decisions we've made at the outset tonight.
Yes, it does explain a lot because the most traditional place to start is what we're drinking, and I can say with authority that tonight I am drinking water.
Our own bad decisions have beaten us down. I'm drinking water as well, but I would give my left foot for a Pedialyte.
You know, I probably would too, but after 5 days of this, I just need something that is neutral.
Yes, it has been a fun 5 days, but it's definitely compromised my ability to live to 80. It's not happening anymore.
That was never going to happen anyway.
Thanks.
So.
You sound a lot like my parents.
Your parents were right as usual.
Yeah. My mom called me when I was 30 and said that she was shocked I'd made it that long. So she's not an optimist, but I keep on
She's
kicking.
a realist.
She is a realist. I love her to pieces, but that was not a happy day.
The reason, of course, that we were, pushing the limits of the party empire was that we went and saw Muse twice.
That's right.
So we went and saw them in Sacramento on Thursday night and then in Oakland on Saturday night.
Yeah.
So usually when they come on tour, we'd like to link up once or twice and go see them. And we've seen them in a bunch of different cities at this point.
Yeah, you know, they played Los Angeles last night. I'm sure you know.
I do.
And I couldn't be happier about skipping it.
You know, it crossed my mind going down there, but there's just a limit. 3 shows in 5 days is a little too much.
Yeah, I need an IV and like a lifeline. So it does explain 2 things, though, I think, aside from our drink choices. 1 is why we're hanging out, and 2 is the song that we've chosen.
Yes. And the song, of course, is a Muse tune because we just saw them.
That's right.
And the song is an homage to the fact that we're 2 weeks away from the LSAT. We're moving into the last 2 weeks in preparation, which is going to be the topic for tonight's discussion. And consequently, we've chosen the song Pressure by Muse, which is another one of their songs to feature Terry Crews. And
I did
honestly,
not know that, actually.
Is too cool for me to like really address. I'm just angry about the fact they continue to get
Has he just
Terry
basically
Crews.
become like a 5th band member at this point?
God, that would be so cool.
Dude, could not agree with you more.
Maybe he was in L.A. Perhaps he showed up on stage and then ripped off his helmet or something at the end, and people were like, Terry Crews.
Don't make me regret missing him more. I will say those were 2 epic shows, and anyone listening to this who gets a chance to see this particular tour cannot recommend it highly enough.
It's good. I think both those shows are really interesting. They get better as the night goes on. On Saturday, we went with a friend of mine, actually a former student of mine from years and years ago. He's a super cool dude. Yeah. And he'd never seen them, and his mind was completely and utterly blown by how good they are, not just musically, but then just the visuals. Yeah. And then the next day, we saw an article in the San Jose Mercury News that basically said that this was the best show of 2019 so far.
Which is premature, but yeah.
It's only March.
That's right. I will say, I don't think Garber's jaw has undropped yet.
No, he really enjoyed it.
He looked stupefied in the best way.
It was great to see him, though.
Yeah, it was good to meet him, actually. He's good
cool
people.
Dude.
So,
anyway,
in talking about music, that has obviously been punishing us a little bit, but it also doesn't help to lose an hour on Sunday night. The antiquated nonsense ritual of daylight savings time. Let me just gripe for a moment.
All right, you go ahead.
Well, no, that's actually the end of it.
That was the gripe?
That was it.
Daylight savings sucks. They need to eliminate it, and it needs to be summertime year-round. That's all I'm going to say about this, and anybody who wants to sponsor a bill, I'll be there for it.
Those feel like very different measures, but okay. All right, the first half I can get on board with. Summertime year-round? Dude, I'm Irish. Like...
Either way,
the thought of sunlight
sucks.
Makes me
on top of all the drinking and late night partying. Now I'm completely beaten down, which is why I'm drinking water.
Do you want to play a little sound effect for daylight savings, Dave?
You know, I do want to play a little sound effect for daylight savings, and here it is.
The most ridiculous thing. Oh my God. Well. To explain what that is, because
that is an odomatone, which is a Japanese kind of like musical toy. And I was watching Muse videos one day, and a video for Algorithm popped up, and this guy has made the whole song using that instrument, and it's actually kind of amazing. It blew me away.
Not a band member. This is a cover of Algorithm by some random talented internet stranger.
Automaton. No, it's amazing. We'll actually link it because it's so crazy to watch. But I knew my daughter would love it. And then when I got it, I discovered that I actually like playing it quite a bit. So it's been a lot of fun. So anytime you hear sound effects, it's going to be me playing that thing. And you'll just have to...
Unless it's me groaning, which those tend to go hand in hand.
It's pretty cool, man.
Well, that's actually a pretty good sound effect for one of today's news articles, one of the headlines of the day, which concerns not so much the LSAT yet, although maybe one day.
Links to it.
It could be, but more just admissions in general. And I don't even know how to set this up, like the power of privilege.
Very much the power of privilege. So if you were following the news today, we're recording this on a Tuesday. The big breaking story is that there is a huge college admissions scandal that has reached across the country and included schools like Stanford, Yale, Georgetown, USC, as well as a host of CEOs and power brokers and a few Hollywood celebrities.
Yeah, some entertainment types in there.
Yeah, Lori Loughlin from Fuller and Fuller House, and Felicity Huffman.
Maybe William H. Macy. See what happens.
Yeah, and then, like the head of a big law firm in New York, Gordon Kaplan, is in trouble. And it's a ton of parents. But the interesting thing about this is it focuses on colleges and universities, and it was called Operation Varsity Blues. Which
the sting operation was Operation Varsity Blues. The parental operation was just Operation Illegal.
Operation Idiot.
Yeah.
But Operation Varsity Blues was really an interesting thing. The FBI set it up because they discovered this guy who was more or less guaranteeing students admission into various colleges for a certain amount. And it involves a whole host of different things that he would do. For example, he had a couple of people that were on his payroll, his bribery payroll, that would change SAT scores. They would actually go in and change the test sheets afterwards.
Not even the scores so much as the actual responses, the answer sheet, right? They would go in and adjust the bubbled in, scantrons.
Yeah, we might as well just address this piece by piece because... it's a little weird.
Well, it's so bananas. I'm not even sure there's a piece that.
Well, they're all bananas. But we'll start with the test cheating because obviously we do testing, and certainly the LSAT in a paper environment would be prone to this, or at least susceptible, I guess is the right word.
That's right.
Instead of prone. And what they were able to do was this guy had two testing centers, one in Houston and one in Los Angeles, where he knew people that worked there and he would bribe them. And what they would do is, in some cases, they'd actually take the test for the student. That was just mind-blowing when that came out. They had an adult who basically took the test in a hotel room and then just turned it in. And flew back to Florida. And in other instances, the student would finish taking the test, and then the person being bribed would sit down, look at their answers, and erase the wrong answers, or many of them, and change them to right answers.
Improve the score sheet for them.
Yep. And so these students would suddenly see SAT scores and ACT scores that were far higher than anything they'd done previously. And if the students had a previous score, they would only increase the score by 30%. To avoid calling attention to the results. So they had a sophisticated plan for their criminality here, but they would pay people
Not
$10,000.
sophisticated enough.
Well, as it turned out.
As we sit here and discuss.
You got to be careful about committing crimes, as they say. So that was one thing that actually happened. And allegedly, it appears that with Felicity Huffman's oldest daughter, that was the method they used, was they had her answers changed. So...
For what, $15,000? Is that what she paid?
It was $15,000 that she paid. And so then all of a sudden they had better scores. But that wasn't the end of the scam. And interestingly enough as well, before we move on from that point, in most of the cases, in all that I've seen so far, the students did not know this was happening.
That's right.
So it was occurring behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the son or daughter taking the test. They just get their score and literally run into the kitchen and be like, "Mom, Dad, I've done amazingly well."
Look at me, 99th percentile all of a sudden.
Yeah, and not realizing that this had been completely manufactured by wealth and privilege.
Yeah, pure fabrication is what these were,
and a lack of ethics. So. whatever. It's kind of like, wow, that's one thing. But that wasn't the only thing that he did. He then
the he being Singer, right? Is that who you're referring to?
William Singer being the guy who was the head of this organization called
I'd call him a
Key
mastermind, but I think that actually might be too much of a compliment.
I don't know. I mean, he clearly was running a pretty big show. I have a feeling he's one of these super connector individuals that was able to meet people and cajole them into, going along with what he was doing, because he bribed so many people that he had to have had a really charismatic kind of approach to this. But what he did then was he went to various coaches, usually not high-profile coaches. This doesn't involve like baseball or basketball coaches. But for example, the sailing coach at Stanford. The crew coach at USC, and the soccer coach at Yale. And then what they would do is they would say, hey, we want to get a student in, we'll pay you. We'll bribe you. And in the case of USC and Yale, they paid the coaches directly. In the case of Stanford, I think the guy didn't keep the money. I think he passed it along to the sailing team so they would have more resources. I wonder if he'll get a lesser sentence because of that. And so the reason that's important is that when the time came and the student was up to be admitted, that coach would come in and say, yes, that's the person I want for my crew team. Yeah. So could you please give them a higher chance of admission? And that pretty much worked.
The crew individuals in this case were Lori Loughlin's two daughters, right?
Yes. And the interesting or abysmally terrible thing about it is that
it's pretty scumbaggy. Let's not cut corners on this.
Yeah, neither of Lori Loughlin's daughters, and I'm going to say allegedly again, had ever allegedly rowed before. And so what had happened was that Mr. Singer had created profiles for them, with pictures of them on like rowing machines, and then like these fake awards and fake contributions that they'd made to various crew clubs and so forth.
Just picturing him photoshopping them into boats.
That's one of them. They had a water polo candidate, and they photoshopped, I believe it's her face onto someone else's picture and sent it off to what I can't remember the school. There's so many indictments on this.
This is heavy duty stuff, 50, 60 so far, and I don't think we've even scratched the surface of where this is going to go.
Yeah, but think about how involved this is. First off, we raise your SAT score in completely false circumstances. Then we create profiles that have no basis in reality.
Athletic profiles, yeah,
athletic profiles. Then we go to these athletic programs and we target people who are lower on the scale of visibility, where no one's going to really question a crew recruit. And in one instance, it came up where the person asked about getting his son into Vanderbilt and going on the football team. And the guy said, there's just no way that's going to work. These guys are all 3.4 GPAs, and they're all like legitimate prospects. Those things are vetted out. There's sites that list every recruit. There's no way somebody who's never played football or hadn't played football in a year is going to make the list. It would just be red flags all over. So he was quite aware of that. But that's a really involved scam, because at the end, they're bribing the coaches.
Yeah.
And then it all came crashing down. And
there's a lot of money in this, man. Like, all right, the William H. Macy's wife didn't pay all that much money.
She got a good deal.
She did get a good deal at $15,000 for a kid who she didn't pay it again for her other kid, by the way. I thought that was interesting.
Which is odd. Where's the love there? Eldest daughter, I will do it for you. Youngest daughter, no
we'll buy
cheating.
the eldest way in, but this youngest one, she's on her own. Lori Loughlin and her husband, allegedly, fashion designer Massimo, paid $500,000
to get into USC.
For two kids. So
yeah, for two children.
Yeah.
I would have,
quarter
thought
apiece.
It would be less for USC or maybe more for Harvard or Yale or what have you. But
stings a little if USC's listening. But $500,000 for two kids to get into USC. Those are the the non-rowers.
Yes, but the scandal here is focused solely on Singer, the head of the organization, the coaches at the various schools who took the bribes.
The Yale women's soccer coach, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Rudy Meredith, again, allegedly.
The people who changed the test scores and altered those things. None of the people who have been indicted are students. And apparently they, by and large, did not know. There's repeated instances of parents saying, I don't want my son to know, or I don't want my daughter to know. So they were like this guiding hand behind the scenes, making things happen, and the kids had no clue that was actually occurring.
Well, Dave, let me ask you maybe the most relevant, obvious question, which is, do you think anything like this could ever happen in the LSAT world?
Sure.
Do you want to elaborate?
No, I just want to say
Yes.
sure and walk away. We were talking about this before the podcast, and at first I was like, well, there's not this athletic kind of scenario, but really there are two ways that this could happen. On the LSAT side, the loophole, so to speak, is going away because what happened in each of these instances, the way these scores were able to be altered was because the students were granted extra time. They were granted accommodations, and because of that, they were then routed to different test centers where this guy had contacts that would do his bidding. Well, I mean, if you think about it for a second, that happens with the LSAT all the time. And I am in no way accusing anybody of taking bribes or anything untoward having
No, I think
happened.
you'd say the same. I'm not aware of any of this ever occurring on the LSAT side.
You just asked me whether it's possible.
Right.
And it is. And I hope LSAC will at least send out some reminders and maybe do some checks just to make sure this kind of thing doesn't pop up. But it's really a limited horizon on this because it will end relatively soon. Once the digital LSAT kicks in full, the ability for someone to go in after the test is over and change answers is largely eliminated.
It's done. Yeah, answers aren't amendable anymore once they've been entered digitally.
Yeah.
And we know, I mean, this is coming. This is a big part. You remember the security thing they held last month or whenever.
I know they're worried about it. Security is a big issue to them. It should be a big issue to them. This is a great example of why they're concerned because stuff like this pops up and you're like, geez,
this
I didn't
is
even think of that.
flagrant, man. This is one of the crazier examples of schemes that I've seen.
You need to find somebody who's needy, who's running a testing center on a university, and the right person would be susceptible to that type of offer.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, you've got this Yale women's soccer coach, 24 years tenure, who's given $400,000 to kind of cheat the system, allegedly.
Yeah, the administrator at USC, it looks like she took millions. She was maybe the assistant or associate athletic director. And so here she was shepherding along these students through the process. And, it hurts everybody. Obviously, one of the things the FBI came out and said is like schools like USC, they weren't involved in this. They were victimized. These were isolated administrators doing this to the school. And USC actually sent a notification out to all their students today that said, we're aware of it. We're going to take action. We've been victimized just like everyone else has. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again.
What do you think happens to these kids who are potentially equal victims?
I've been wondering that all day. I don't know. This is
it's
like,
hard to punish a kid, kick a kid out of school who doesn't deserve to be there just because they were, again, the victims of circumstance, if you could call it, the beneficiaries of circumstance. Your parents paid $500,000 for you and your sister to go to school and not crew.
You're not supposed to be there, though.
I know, but how do you...
Your credentials are false.
The jury found OJ innocent. I mean, these things happen.
These are different
Is that too?
cases. Yeah, that's just too far afield, man. Your analogy does not hold.
Come on, it does. That absolutely holds. In fact, he walked around for a long time.
You're the unknowing beneficiary,
right?
In many instances of falsified records.
Is that why my analogy doesn't hold? Is he knew?
We're not going there.
Get off, OJ. All right.
Yeah. So
Stand by it.
You didn't achieve that score. The problem is you never knew that you didn't achieve it. You thought that you got a 32 on the ACT.
ACT, yeah. And
so it's kind of, I understand the ethical dilemma, but at the same time, I kind of feel like, all right, we're sorry that that's happened. I don't think that's what's going to occur. I think they're going to let these kids go through the system. And what's maybe worse, and when you take a look at this, is they didn't have to do it this way. There's a completely legitimate way for people of extreme wealth to contribute to schools and get their children in. It's been big-time donor scenarios have been happening for years and years. Yeah. A guy like Massimo and his wife, Lori Singer, could have said, we're going to go ahead and give you guys $2 million. Now let our daughter in. Yeah, it's more expensive, but it's completely legitimate, no matter what you think of it morally.
What did you describe it as earlier? The side door versus the back door?
No, it's what Singer actually described.
Oh, that's what Singer said. Okay. Singer being the kind of central culprit. Yeah.
He said there's 3 ways into school. There's the front door, which is the legitimate, you apply on your own, you get in on your own merits. That was the phrase that he used. He knew what he was doing. There's the back door, which is the most expensive way, which is you give a building or you endow a chair. And then there's the side door, which he's like, I created this and it's 100% effective.
Yeah, and 10% is expensive.
Yeah. So they were like, it's really, we're going to bribe you in one way or the other, but this is going to be cheaper.
Yeah, unless you're Felicity Huffman, who basically got like the ramen noodle deal. Like she, 15 grand? Come on.
You know, we can say that she's apparently, allegedly, a good business mind.
She's a great businesswoman.
Anyway, the other thing about the LSAT that, comes back to, we talked about, could the test results be altered? I honestly never thought about it, but yeah, in a situation where you have extra time and you take it under special circumstances, that could certainly have come up in the past. It could come up in the next couple of tests. Sure. I don't know of it happening.
And let's not forget, I mean, they're not going digital internationally, so.
Yeah, there's still available routes. The other thing is this, is there the ability...
As anyone listening to this, like, starts to furiously look out flights. European test dates.
I'm going to New Zealand. Not me.
No, don't do it.
But, there's not that little sporting profile scenario that you get with law school. You're not going to get a position on the crew team through law school. It's really only undergraduate. So that access angle doesn't exist. But what was kind of depressing to me was how easy it was for him to just make up a whole bunch of stuff that never was checked.
Yeah.
And I do believe that's the kind of thing that could occur. If you do that, and I'll warn you right now, if they find out about it later, you're going to be disbarred.
Yeah.
So everything that you're doing would go down the drain. So that's a very strong warning to everybody. But could somebody who's on an admissions committee be susceptible to this type of behavior? Yeah. But you can't legislate against human behavior.
Yeah.
Some people are bad, some people are good, and hopefully you're a law school, you're hiring good people, and if something like this popped up, they'd report it.
Yeah.
When people at LSAC had that note on their car like, hey, here's a $100 bill, meet me, they turned him in.
That's a story no one listening to this knows that we've discussed, but it's for you and me, that's a pretty famous story.
It's a good example of how to handle it the appropriate way. Somebody's trying to bribe you to get some kind of unfair advantage, tell somebody. In this case, somebody eventually did, and then the FBI got in, and once they did that, they just documented everything.
Yeah.
So, anyway, it's a really interesting story. I'm sure there's going to be more to it. We've talked about it, I think, enough, and I also think that the connections to law school hopefully never come to, I'm not going to say fruition because that's not what it is, but they never actually happen.
They never come to pass. Yeah, Operation Varsity Blues.
Which, do you know what the Varsity Blues is?
I know that terrible movie with Dawson from Dawson's Creek.
James Vanderbeek is awesome. Do not criticize him.
All right. Well, that's all I got.
And that's not a terrible movie, by the way. That movie is also excellent. Jonathan Moxon.
I don't want your life. What do you want me to say, dude? I don't.
That's like the most famous line in that film.
Come on. I know.
It's got a pretty good cast, though, man. It's
the
got
backup
John
quarterback
Voight.
has excellent hair.
Yeah.
That's as far as I'll go with it.
It's got your friend Amy Smart. It's got Alan Marder in it.
Yeah, I miss her.
It's got Paul Walker in it.
Paul Walker was in that?
Yes, man. He's like the star who gets his leg hurt and then he coaches them at the very last game after Kilmer had been tossed out. And yes, I have not watched that film anytime recently. I just happen to know that.
An impressive memory. Let's talk about more recent things, please.
Yes, please.
What's been going on lately in the LSAT world?
Not a whole lot, thankfully. Especially after last week. The only thing they really did was they did another one of their famous podcasts, the Keeping Up to Data. How long do you think this one was, John? Give me an over-under.
Well, this isn't fair because I know, but a competitive over-under for anyone out there would be 5 minutes, and they'd be well served to take the under.
Yes. I would have said 4 minutes.
Okay.
And you still would be up and down. This one came in pretty long. It was 4 minutes and 57 seconds. There you go. And it wasn't the same guy who'd been doing it. They got a new person to read it. So that was a little bit of a change. Not sure what maybe they're just spreading around the podcast love there.
There you go. We will throw the transcript into the notes.
You want to do the quick review of it, or you want me to?
Go for it.
All right.
I know you're really excited to.
Well, yeah, this will be 25 seconds of summarization. So what they really did was they updated the applications that are coming into law schools right now, and they're down very slightly, about 0.2%. Yeah. So a very, very small amount. But they did say that the number of applicants in the system is up, and that's at 3.7% up. Mm-hmm. So those numbers are improving based upon last year. And what it could mean is that there's a bunch of people in there who are thinking about applying or taking the LSAT, but they haven't done so yet. So if they come in late and put in a bunch of applications, then we'll see the applications rise.
Right.
But it also might be the case that they won't. Interestingly enough, one of the facts they later revealed was that about 10% of the registrants in their system don't take the LSAT.
Not interesting.
I think last year they said they had 142 registrants in the system and only 90% of them took the test. And these are not year to year. This is their special testing cycle that they do.
This is June 2017 to February 2018.
Yeah, exactly. So, almost 2 years ago. And this year they have 149,000 registrants. So an increase, but again, you don't know how many of them are actually going to take the LSAT or not.
You got to admit, though, it's interesting that 10% of these people sign up to take the test and never do.
I thought that was interesting. That really jumped out at me as being a relatively high number. Mm-hmm. The question is, did they just sign up for an account? Like I have an account with LSAC, but I don't register
so I'm
to take
contributing
the test.
to that 10%.
Yeah, so some of it is just, somebody's like, I think I want to apply to law school. They go to the website and they're like, oh, you got to sign up. And then they don't pay anything or go anywhere with it.
If anyone's out there wondering if we're screwing up the curve.
Exactly.
We're not.
They also said they had a couple new reports available to member law schools, but to be honest, that's for them, not for us. We're just going to ignore those.
Yeah. It is interesting, though. More applicants, a slightly lower application number, which is, I think, sometimes hard to reconcile when you first hear it.
Maybe more people with initial interest, but not running it through to completion.
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's move on because
let's do, because honestly, this was a slow week in LSAT world.
We spent all our time on the admission scandal, which is where it should have been. So
it's by far the most interesting thing that's happened. It's also the most recent. So
let's jump to the topic of the night.
Let's do it.
Which is how to use the last 2 weeks before an LSAT to prepare for that test. So in our case, we're coming up on the March 2019 LSAT, but this is going to apply
as of this recording, 2.5 weeks. So
but it'll apply to any LSAT. And we're not going to record this.
That's one of my favorite things about this conversation is if you were to hear this in November, 2 weeks prior, this is still entirely relevant. If you heard this in 2022, entirely relevant.
That's exactly right.
And as we have done before in talking about kind of like your sights set on this, hopefully, finish line, the first place I think to start is mentality.
Agreed.
Yeah, it's just so important, especially now when you have hopefully learned most of the things that you need to know, that you start to focus instead, almost internally, getting your head in the right place.
Exactly. A lot of times people think that taking a test and doing well on it is all about like, what do I know? Mm-hmm. And I think that is a big part of it. However, an equal part is your own mental approach to the test and how you handle things like anxiety and focus and so forth. Because you might know everything in the world, but if you can't get it down on the page, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, you might be the calmest person in the world, but if you don't know anything about the test, that's not going to help. We talk about speed and accuracy being really important when taking the test itself and doing questions, but this balance between knowledge and mentality is equally important on a broader scale.
Yeah. I mean, knowledge, I think, has to take priority over confidence or over some sense of like calm.
Yeah.
But you really can't reach your full potential unless you have both.
That's correct. Just like accuracy takes precedence over speed.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But same exact idea.
Exactly. Yeah. If it takes you 6 minutes a question, you're screwed no matter how accurate you are.
So if you're sitting there and you're 2.5 weeks out from the test, what are you trying to do from a mentality standpoint?
Honestly, my biggest goal, if I'm in that position, is getting myself to some degree of like self-assuredness where I just feel entirely rock solid. I know I'm going to walk into that room and no matter what happens, I'm going to survive it. I'm going to thrive. And so I'm looking for those moments of like pure performance. That's my big goal in the final couple of weeks.
Okay.
And we'll talk. I'm sure we'll talk about this in terms of like what it means for practice tests and stuff.
Yes.
But
this is a thread that will run through this entire discussion.
Yes, it's impossible.
It's so important. I would actually say for me, it's calmness.
Really?
Yeah, there's no reason to get overly hyped about anything right now or overly worried. Maintain your calm and focus as you kind of go through these last couple of weeks, because it's easy to start feeling like everything's spinning out of control.
Right.
But it's coming up too soon. I'm not ready. I don't know how to do this type of question. Every time I get killed by it. And these things take on an outsized importance when in reality, they're not that big of a deal. Everything is limited in terms of like the damage that it can cause on the test, because there's not going to be 100 questions that are flawing the reasoning.
Yeah. Dave, I think you relayed a story to me that I was unaware of at the time, but has become one of my like go-tos for students, about an interview, an old interview, maybe Sports Illustrated or something, with Tiger Woods and his swing thoughts as he stood over a ball. And you would think it would be the sort of thing like keep your back straight, keep your head down, like bend your knees, whatever kind of mechanical. But it wasn't. Tiger Woods' swing thought, singular, was smooth. I don't know if you remember this.
Oh, I remember quite well.
Yeah. And I've always just found that not only fascinating, but really kind of like inspirational. Of this is a guy who could trust his training so well, who was so confident in his own almost muscle memory and abilities, that all he had to do was remind himself to just stay calm. Be smooth.
It's a broad-based focus.
It's beautiful.
It's easy to remember, and it doesn't get you thinking about all sorts of details
Outcomes,
or mechanical issues.
Exactly.
And as soon as you start doing that, you start focusing on like, okay, I got to keep my elbow down. Oh, did my elbow come up? And then everything's out of kilter.
That's right. Yeah, if you know what you're doing, then all you have to do is just trust your process. We've talked about this before, but I think in terms of mentality, it really plays a central role to this whole theme.
It really does. There's another story from the sporting world that I think goes hand in hand with that. And
Jordan?
No, not Jordan.
Interesting.
Although I think that's a great example.
I knew the Jordan story. What do you got?
Missed the game-winning shot 30 times and all this kind of stuff. That's how I know what it takes to actually hit the winning shot. It's not that. It was a basketball player at Memphis University, and he'd gotten down, and it's been a while. It's been like at least a decade. And he missed some shots at the end of the game. He was actually a pretty decent free throw shooter. But the problem was when he got up to the line, he wasn't thinking like, okay, relax or smooth flow or hit the back of the net, any of those things that would have actually worked. He was thinking about what it would mean to win the game. And it would put them into the NCAA tournament or have them progress. And that thinking of consequences was a killer.
Yeah.
Because you're not thinking about the shot anymore. You're not focused on like, let me just have everything work together. You're now building all this pressure. And students who are taking the LSAT tend to do this a lot, where they're like, okay, if I can get a 165, then I can get into these schools. If I get a 168, I'll get into these schools. And if I can get a 171, I'll get into these schools. And then they start thinking, then I'll have better career options. I'll make more money. And the pressure just becomes massive and overwhelming. You cannot think about consequences. You just have to think about like, be focused, be relaxed, those kinds of things. And we have an ultimate test mentality list on our blog that we'll post in connection with this blog.
That's a good idea.
Where we talk about all sorts of things that relate to this. And, test mentality has become one of my favorite things to talk about. And there's a million stories from the sporting world, not just the Jordan example, but like there's a great Andy Murray article about the reminders that he goes through. There's a ton of different things that are interesting.
He's become something of a pariah, but even Lance Armstrong, his visualization techniques were incredible.
Yeah.
He had help, but it was
interesting Lance reference with the cheaters earlier.
I know.
Nice.
Trust me, it crossed my mind.
I see what you did there.
He did a lot of things right.
Well,
Despite
he
a few things
apparently
wrong.
got really good blood doping. He did a great job with that. Anyway, the point is that when you think about mentality, it's about making sure that you were positive, that you were focused, and that you were calm going through this. And if you feel like you're losing your grip, and that happens to everybody, to take a step back, to try to get out of the environment for a little bit, even if it's like to take a walk for 15 minutes. Don't let yourself go down into that black hole of like, I'm so stressed by this, or I have to do well. Because that is not going to help you to retain the information. It's not going to help you to apply it during any kind of test environment.
Yeah, don't take any 15-minute walks during the test. But leading into it, it's a really useful thing to do to kind of get out of your own way sometimes.
Yes.
To me, the biggest thing that I always try to stress to students is be present. Like, be in that moment. Don't worry about outcomes. Don't even worry about... You've one of my favorite little quips of yours is what you, I think, have called like question hangover. which feels remarkably appropriate at the moment.
All too appropriate.
Where you talk about like you need this weird amnesia sometimes where it's like, look, question 14 just happened. I'm on 15 now. What's happening now? You've got to be extremely present, extremely in that moment.
You got to have shooter's mentality, as they say in basketball.
Yes.
You might have missed the last 10 shots, but when the game's on the line,
you're going to hit 11.
Yeah, you don't think about the 10 misses. You think about the shot that you're taking.
That's right.
And question hangover is, as they say, it's real.
It's very real. Yeah.
You know, if question's tough and you slide into the next question and you're still thinking about the last one, guess what? You've just made yourself more likely to miss the question you're doing now.
But I think that really speaks to what the objective is for these final couple of days, weeks, is you've really got to linger on the best circumstances, on the happiest of occurrences, on your success.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means tapering down.
It's almost focus and isolation.
Yeah.
You stay in the moment and you've got to isolate that and not try to connect it back to everything that could all of a sudden rear up and make you feel bad.
Right. Which is why you and I both have talked a lot about this previously with people about prioritizing quality over quantity. That these final few weeks don't really need to be jam-packed 10 hours a day. It can be, I had a really good Tuesday for this 2 hours, for this 45 minutes. And that, to me, is enough for me to just sit back and concentrate on.
It feels productive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is productive if it means that the mentality result is one that lingers.
Yeah. I mean, the whole process in the last 2 weeks, you should probably be tapering down anyway, because you can't just go full bore all the way up to the test and then expect that the test is going to go perfectly well. You need to build up some reserves. And the example I like to use is swim teams. They don't like do full practices every day the week before the actual meet. They taper it down where they do less and less and less, and they build up that energy so that on the actual swim meet day, they have as much energy as possible.
Yeah. What's funny is you actually mentioned that exact example in a previous blog, and I think it's a good one. So good, in fact, that some swimmer came in and commented on one of the blog posts previously and was like, I love that. That's perfect. I was like, well, there you go.
It's based on reality.
Yeah.
But, you know, the similar thing would be if you're a runner and you've got a marathon in 2 weeks, you know, doing a practice marathon now or like, you know, 10 miles, that's not a big deal. A lot of people are running that anyway. But would you run like 3 or 4 marathons in the 5 days before the final meet that you had? No, you wouldn't. You would slowly bring it down, especially, and you do all the other stuff that runners do, like carb load and everything.
Yeah. So I wrote an article on this, however long ago, longer ago than I'd like to admit, probably, but it's still relevant, where it talks about essentially quality versus quantity, how to balance those things. I will post that into the comments here as well. But one other theme that I think is going to run as an undercurrent of all this is everything you do can be prioritized in terms of the value you get from it, as opposed to the bulk or the volume of the work.
Yeah. And if you're tapering your time down, that means you're going to have less time to spend. So that's where the quality versus quantity argument comes in. It's not about doing volume. It's about doing good work.
Yeah. So how do you then begin to prioritize where to spend your time in terms of learning?
Yeah. Let's talk about that, because the first thing is students come in the last couple of weeks, and if they've been doing it what we call the right way, they're already well positioned to do this. They already have an idea of their strengths and weaknesses. They're already sitting in a situation where they know exactly what they need to work on. And hopefully if they listened to last week, they have a better understanding of what the test makers are going to test them on, and they can combine those things.
And if you guys didn't listen to last week and you're listening to this now, last week we talked about what to expect in March specifically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the first thing that I would say is, if you were trying to figure out, well, where am I, is go look at all your analytics for your practice tests. And if you're inside of our test scoring system, it shows you your performance on various types of questions, various sections, and test after test. So you can actually see that. And any good analytics site should do that. That gives you a very broad blueprint that tells you, these are all the things that I at least have to know. And then this is how I'm performing in all those individual areas. And the first part that you're going to take a look at is, all right, what's clearly a weak spot for me? If I keep getting to flaw questions and method questions and all of a sudden my performance just nosedives, you know that you need to go look at those. Or you're looking at logic games and you're like, I'm pretty good at linear, but this grouping stuff is killing me.
Right.
All right. Then you know that grouping is an area that you actually have to go focus in.
They've labeled these two as templates, and I didn't see them. That's a clear opportunity to improve.
Or if you see that over and over, I keep getting screwed up on these games that are about possibilities. I'm not showing those possibilities. I better sit down and look at games that deal with possibilities, refresh myself on this, and understand what led to the scenario where they showed all the possibilities, and also what led to the scenario where I didn't. Why didn't I think this was the right choice? Was I scared it was going to take too much time? All those types of things. You need to ask yourself and analyze your performance, but you do have an outline that tells you all sorts of interesting things about what to know and how you're performing on those.
Yeah. That's funny that you bring that up. We talked about this before, Dave, about the introspective nature of self-analysis or post-test analysis, that it's a lot more about like, here's how I reacted to this thing versus just here's how this works. And I think a lot of people overlook that side of it. Like, what did it do to you, though? How did your mind respond to this as opposed to just like, here's why C is right?
What's your interpretation of what's there? And that's one of the harder things. I mean, we see this with people reading LR stimuli all the time. They're like, I thought it meant this. And I'm like, let's go back and take a look at what it actually says. How did you interpret that? This is where we got ourselves into trouble. And this is the kind of thing that you can't miss next time.
Perfect. So those analytics will obviously tell you basically the areas not only to know, but where it is that you stand to gain the most ground.
Exactly.
But there are other aspects to this too. For instance, there are things that either you don't know or maybe things that are just old, ancient.
You've forgotten.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to say it, but the nature sometimes of a course deals with this, that there are things that you see in early lessons that don't necessarily come up again for a while.
You might get
and I'd like to say that our
something.
courses are pretty well designed to reintroduce the key elements. Must be true comes up in lesson 2. It must be true comes up again later. But there are things that maybe are just a little dusty.
Well, if you've been studying for, say, 5 or 6 months, and I think the example I used when we were talking about this before was, and you've kind of forgotten about resolve questions.
That's a good example.
Then go back and look at those and make sure that you actually understand it. Use whatever materials that is, whether it's our course materials or the LSAT Bibles or someone else's materials, whatever you have, go back and check that. And I also feel like that's a very interesting way to test yourself also. Like you can open up a copy of the LR Bible and be like, all right, let me just go to this chapter and read a few pages or scan a few pages and be like, does this make sense? Or am I reading a bunch of stuff that I don't remember or maybe I've never even knew? You can spot check yourself on both sides of the equation by looking at practice test analytics, but also by looking at your materials and saying, how well do I know this?
Putting yourself almost on the spot to test your own comfort level.
100%.
I like that. Yeah. Open it to a random page and see if you know what's going on.
Yeah, I think the example I use is that in resolve questions, there's a saying about this I love so much, which is that you can't explain a difference with a similarity, and you can't explain a similarity with a difference.
And most people hear that and they're like, what is this gibberish?
Yeah. If you've never heard that before, it's something really useful to know. And it's the kind of details that we like to pack into our materials because I never know when a question's going to come up that's going to trade on that information.
Right.
So if you read that and you're like, wait, that sounds like a complete revelation, that means that you need to refresh a little bit more on those materials just to make it current.
Yeah. Yeah, shock and awe is ultimately a negative thing.
Yeah, do you need to study it for 6 hours though?
Well, I mean, I think that actually gets to the point of like outlier ideas.
Exactly. The answer is no.
No, is the answer.
6 hours on like those concepts is too much. But you could glance through it and in 30 to 45 or maybe even 60 minutes, really refresh yourself and be like, you know what, I'm back to currency on resolve questions and let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah. It's funny, we talk a little bit about outliers. Next week, I suspect we're probably going to get into the idea of some outlier question types, just because that's what you do at the very end of this, like the 11th hour stuff. But for now, the main focus really needs to be avoidance of outliers, avoidance of one-offs, formal logic, these kinds of like really low-level occurrences.
Yeah, go with the big things, which is what we talked about last week. What are they going to test you on? That's what you should be really focused on. But then also don't get so focused on those that you exclude other areas. Don't think, I know I'm going to see linear, so that's all I'm going to do. You can't do it. You need balance in all things, and especially in studying not just all logic games. It's good to have a little LR and RC in there, even if you're really good at those areas, just to keep fresh. So don't become obsessed.
Yeah. Although at some point I do think, and I don't want to put caveats on this because you're clearly right, but at some point people do need to drill it down or dial it down into these more focused kind of concerns. In other words, if you're really, really good at logic games, -1, and you kind of suck at reading comp, are you still a practice test person? Are you still like a full-scale study person? Probably not, right?
You're clearly going to head into RC land and focus on that the majority of the time.
I guess my point is there's a degree of individuality that has to play a role here, and that becomes a little bit challenging for us to legislate or mandate.
Yeah, we can't describe a perfect solution for every situation.
There's no universal prescription.
Yeah, there's guidelines, though. In a situation like that, I'd be like, spend the most of your time on RC, but throw in the occasional game or game section, because you don't want to lose that edge if you're down to -1.
That's right.
You want to make sure that is the rock that you think it is.
Yeah, you want that. It's bedrock, man. It's foundational. And I think that's what you mean about, like, don't become so obsessed with one area that it becomes exclusionary to others. Because these things are skills. They do tend to go away a little bit. You can grow some rust.
Oh, they'll erode if you don't work on them. We know that. We also know that you'll subconsciously get better over time once you've done enough studying and you take a break. But usually when people come back, they have to shake the rust off, and then all of a sudden they're like, I'm better now.
Yeah.
I'm like,
You wrote a great article about that, in fact.
Yeah, that's a known effect here about taking breaks from the test and the benefits that can accrue to any test taker.
So when it comes to full-scale testing, what do you recommend? Like, do you have is there a minimum? Is there a standard regimen? This many tests a week? This often? This frequency?
It's funny because it would be really easy to joke about this, but I don't even want to make a joke, because if somebody just heard a random number, they'd be like, I tried to do what Dave said, and 14 practice tests burned me out.
What do you mean 3 a day is too much?
I actually am more of a minimalist at this point. Now, this wouldn't be the case if we were 3 months from the LSAT.
Right.
But in the last week or two, 2 to 3 LSATs a week really, to me, is the maximum that you should be doing. And again, this is very personalized. If somebody's studying 40 hours a week, they have more options, and I could see bending that rule, versus someone who's only studying 4 hours a week. Doing 2 to 3 practice tests would probably not be the best use of their time. So this is flexible. But if we were just talking about somebody who's studying pretty hard, they've got 2 weeks to go. 2 weeks out, I could see doing 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, the segue there is, what happens in that final week? Because I would not want to see you do 3 tests in the final week.
This not if you hit some kind of like high mark, some high water moment where you're like, man, I crushed this one.
Let's talk about that point.
I think
because
we should.
I think this is an area that both you and I see consistently in the week before an LSAT.
And it's counterintuitive for a lot of people. People don't necessarily recognize this moment of opportunity.
Yeah, my general rule is this, is if you have a really good practice test performance within about 6 or 7 days of the test, stop taking full tests. Now, when I say really good, it is, again, relative. If you are 20 points from where you need to be and you just got a practice test that's 2 points higher than what you've been scoring, you can keep on taking tests because you still have a long way to go. But let's say you're out there and you were trying to score a 163. And you just took a practice test and got a 167. I would probably say stop. Not stop studying.
Right.
Stop taking further practice tests.
Yeah.
And the reason isn't because you've done well. That certainly does help. It's because of what could happen if you take another test.
I wouldn't have framed it that way.
Oh, how would you have framed it?
Well,
I want to hear so I can disagree with you.
No, you seem to be caging it in potential negative outcomes. And I would say once you know you've reached that level, you know you're there. Focus instead on smaller issues.
Fair enough. I won't disagree with that, which is much to my regret because I love to disagree with you.
Well, no, it's because I'm sitting near you.
Well, part of it is also, I just reach over and punch you.
Well, yeah, exactly. I just get up and go drink your wine inside.
You do that all the time anyway. It's one of the downsides of having you as a guest here.
We both look the way we do.
Definitely not feeling good today.
You're
But
doing all right. But
the reason I cage it in a somewhat negative light there is because how many times have you had questions or gotten frantic calls or seen posts on any given forum where they're like, the LSAT's in 2 days and I just took a test and I did terribly. And panic ensues.
Thousands, hundreds of thousands. But
So
I don't.
many, too
That
many to count.
potential fear wouldn't frame my choice or wouldn't frame my advice. That's my point.
That's fine. It still is underlying it.
Yeah. But if you know you've done a thing that is satisfactory, let that be your hinge. Like, hang to that point and then focus on other things that are going to help to maintain it, as opposed to, again, trying to duplicate something that's already been successful.
Instead
if
of
you know
trying
you can
to-
run a marathon in a certain amount of time, mostly you just need to stretch.
Yeah, do you need to reprove it to yourself?
Exactly.
No, but that's what's happening. And I realize that people are saying, well, I want to get the experience and stuff. I'm like,
But it's not because I fear the next time I go run, I'm going to sprain my ankle.
no. But if you want a 163 and that is your goal, and you have shown that you are a 167, it's like, okay, you don't need to prove that you can get a 163. You can.
Precisely.
So instead, spend that time focusing on just other questions and sections.
Yeah.
Don't put yourself on the line and score a 159 and then start asking yourself questions where you're like, am I really a 163? That 167 was just luck.
Yeah. Again, in my mind, 159 is so off the table at that point, it never occurs to me.
Yes, but that's you.
Well, it's me vicarious to any student. It's me
You
standing
with the
there.
right test mentality.
Right.
The
But isn't
problem
that,
is, that's not universal yet.
I know, but isn't that why people listen to this?
Sure. And that's why I'm saying what I'm saying, why you're saying what you're saying.
Right.
But the problem is that a lot of people are like, no, I'm going to take one more. They want to reconfirm their ability. And again, 3 months out, you should be reconfirming your ability. 5 days beforehand, you don't need to.
Or with maybe some kind of circumstance where that test is debatable. Like, yeah, I did that test before. Or, yeah, but that test was 92.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but I did give myself 3 extra minutes. Assuming none of those circumstances are in play, when you can hit your number, focus on other stuff.
Assuming it's a legitimate test experience.
Exactly.
Yes. That's funny. We have to add a
that
caveat
Lori
about...
Loughlin didn't somehow involve herself, allegedly.
I wanted to just make a cheating reference and you beat me to it. Wow, damn.
Gotcha.
So, the number of practice tests per week, what we're saying is it's actually going to change and probably diminish in the last 2 weeks, which is contrary to a lot of the advice that you hear. Mm-hmm. So think about that as you kind of go forward and look for your performances. If you do really well, maybe it's time to take a break.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about taking the test the day before and you're feeling uneasy, maybe don't put yourself in a position where something bad could happen that would really spin you out and undermine your position.
Yeah, or you're just feeling like we are, where a good night's sleep is such a distant memory that maybe you just need to give yourself a break.
It's in my future, though.
I hope you're right.
So, and of course, taking a lot of practice tests is almost like you're asking for burnout because they are grueling. And so this does a lot of things if you really control your practice testing. And it doesn't mean you have to give up doing timed exercises. You can still do sections. You can do sets of 10 questions or 5 questions or whatever works. So just think about it because it's test mentality that's really driving this decision. Once again, showing how important that is.
It's just impossible to escape. I made the recommendation on a previous episode where I talked about, like, look, if you reach a point where you're scoring really well, let's say you're a 166, a 171, let's say you're in there, you probably don't need to do full logical reasoning sections. You may not need to do every single logic game, but you can isolate the hardest ones. You can cherry pick, and that becomes a far more relevant and useful way to spend your time.
It really does. Yeah. So you take all those practice tests, or you don't take that many practice tests. One of the key components is getting the greatest value out of the tests that you actually take. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about reviewing exams.
That's all about review. Yeah.
Yeah. And what are you looking for? Last week, we made an interesting comment about September and November being 2 tests that you really should review closely.
And that's inescapable to me. Like I said, I'll say it again. If you don't know those tests cover to cover, you're really doing yourself a disservice, even if, and I'm going to take a brief detour, even if they were to dust off something from, say, 2015 or 2016. To me, there's just no better test than September and November of last year to master.
They'll make you better.
Yeah. Those tests are so good, despite the fact that I think it's probably going to be an older test here in March. If you're listening to this down the road, September, November 2018, buckle up. You got to know those.
Yeah, they're really useful exams to watch the test making ability. And we'll talk about a question here in a little bit and kind of like go through that very briefly. But let's talk a little bit about like methods of review.
Okay.
So, and I'm not going to go through these briefly. We've got a great article on reviewing practice tests. We'll just link that in here.
Yeah.
But keep in mind that you can do it in different ways. And some people are really committed to their way of doing it. Like they finish the test, they want to look at their answers immediately, they go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
Or they use blind review and they finish the test, they note all the ones that were problematic, then they redo those questions and they check their scores and see the difference. And I always have the same answer on this. I like all ways of review. So to me, doing the same thing over and over again is boring. And as they say, if you think you're going to get some kind of different result, it's the definition of insanity. So I always tell people, use different methods.
Glad your wife can over here. Or my girlfriend. I would say, I agree with you. Yeah, you need to mix this stuff up.
Yeah, and that article talks about a couple of different ways. You know, there's like a blind review, delayed blind review, and then just like a straight up immediate review. You might like blind review and want to do it 50% of the time. Well, mix it up with some of the others then and give yourself the opportunity to have different experiences because you don't necessarily know which type of review experience is going to give you the greatest feedback.
Right.
And it might change.
It does
in
change.
March, one version might be better, and then later on in April, a different version might be better.
I'll tell you the game, and I'm sure I've told you this before, that I used to play with myself when it came to review was I would play basically a confidence game, a little like self-wager. And what I would do is I would go through questions and rank how certain I was that I was right or wrong, or I guess right or uncertain, on a 1 to 5 kind of scale, where 5 is like I'm betting the mortgage. Like there's 0 chance I missed this question. Down to 1, which happily there weren't many. But you could kind of run through this, and it taught me a lot in terms of my own self-assessment, if that makes sense.
It does.
Because it tells you what it is that's causing issues, potentially. Let's say you're ranking yourself too confidently, then you really you're missing questions that you think you've gotten right, which means you're overestimating your understanding the underlying concept versus underestimating getting questions right, which ultimately tells you that you need to trust your instincts more. That's the whole thing of like, man, I second guessed, I changed the right answer to a wrong, I hesitated. This is where you can make these very clear determinations. That's always been one of my favorite ways to review tests.
It's funny because that is, I think it's like a form of blind review where you're testing your own personal confidence.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's blind review where you quantify it, basically.
Interestingly enough, just as kind of like a corollary to that, I had wrote an article a long time ago about how to estimate scales and your own performance. And one of the things that I said would be really useful is that as you do practice tests, estimate the number of questions that you got right or wrong each time, and then go back and check it against how you actually did. Because if you've only done it one time and it's on the day of the real LSAT, those results, in your opinion, they don't have any baseline.
Right.
You don't know how accurate you are historically. And so it's nice that you're like, I think I got between this and this, but you don't have any way of checking it. And what you should be doing instead is kind of like a second level thing with what you're saying, which is, all right, this was my confidence level. So now I believe I've gotten between 18 and 20 questions right in this section.
Right. Well, it calibrates your reality, which is so important in this, especially given, and you and I both know this better than just about anyone, people are so bad at self-assessment on the heels of a real thing, or even a full practice test, man. I have students come back to me like, I crushed it. I'm like, really? When they didn't. Or they come back and they're like, oh, I almost canceled a 178 one time. Like, people are just terrible self-estimators.
People have done that, so.
Well, I'm an idiot. Yeah.
But you can get better at it by practicing, and you can also get a better assessment of like, look, I'm only close to being right about 50% of the time. So when I tell you this is what I think I did, I don't know how right I am.
That's right.
That's a really helpful piece of information to have.
The nature of how you badly self-assess tells you a lot too.
Sure.
Not only like, oh man, I'm terrible at this, but I'm terrible for this reason, if that makes sense.
100%.
Yeah. So I think that's a really important thing, and your article touches on it. I wrote an article about some of this too, which I can also throw in, but that's the key. And take your time, honestly.
Well, that time and kind of going slowly is incredibly important. Don't rush your review, because then it's like you spent all this time doing the question, you've gotten everything ready to look at it, and then you just gloss through it. You don't get any of the value out of it. Yeah. That's a huge mistake.
This has come up in nearly every episode so far, Dave, where you and I have talked about the value of individual moments, questions, like opportunities. More is, or less is more, I think, in a lot of cases with this.
Exactly right. And you never know when there's going to be that question that after a few minutes you're like, oh, this makes sense. And all of a sudden you see a vista open up where you're like, I think I've been missing this over and over again, but now I understand what they're doing.
Yeah, and certainly questions that you find obvious or easy, self-intuitive, are one thing. But there's a lot of value to be gained from trickier questions. Do you want to go through one? Have I jumped the gun? I'm eager to get into a question.
I just want to make one last comment, though, is I really agree with that. Don't worry so much about the easier questions. The value in the LSAT isn't in the questions that 95% of the people get right.
Right.
It's the ones that are down, the percentages that are 30, 40, 50, 60%, where they're separator questions. If you have a question where 55% of the students get it right, you most assuredly want to be in the 55%. Because you're tracking towards a higher score at that point.
Such a good
point. 45%, there's something that they're missing that you can learn from. So because we think this is such an important concept in terms of reviewing, we wanted to kind of pull out an example question and go through it and really just kind of break it down. So we have taken...
This is not the easiest question, by the way. I should go ahead and mention this. This question was a separator question, I think.
It definitely was a separator question. So what we're going to do is we're going to do from the first of the two LR sections on the June 2007 LSAT, we're going to do question number 14, which is about raw milk. So I will read the question just so everybody is on the same page. You good with that?
I am. I hope you get it right.
I'll get it right.
I'm rooting for you.
Here's what I am going to do, though. I have a terrible tendency, as I do this on the LSAT too, as I read, to immediately just start breaking things down.
Yeah, it's hard not to almost interrupt yourself.
I do it constantly. I'm like, well, look at that. I can't believe they said that. That's ridiculous.
The same.
I am not going to do that.
Okay.
I'm simply going to read the question and not
All right, so
give
anything you hear out of
it.
Dave's face is just strict off the page.
All right, number 14. A cup of raw milk, after being heated in a microwave oven to 50 degrees Celsius, contains half its initial concentration of a particular enzyme, lysozyme. If, however, the milk reaches that temperature through exposure to a conventional heat source of 50 degrees Celsius, it will contain nearly all of its initial concentration of the enzyme. Therefore, what destroys the enzyme is not heat, but microwaves, which generate heat. The question stem is, which one of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the argument? Answer choice A.
Oh, do you want to just launch straight into it?
Yep. I'm gonna read the whole thing.
No analysis. Go for it.
Well, I want to, but
do your thing. I know.
Answer choice A. Heating raw milk in a microwave oven to a temperature of 100 degrees Celsius destroys nearly all of the lysozyme initially present in that milk. Answer choice B. Enzymes in raw milk that are destroyed through excessive heating can be replaced by adding enzymes that have been extracted from other sources. Answer choice C. A liquid exposed to a conventional heat source of exactly 50 degrees Celsius will reach that temperature more slowly than it would if it were exposed to a conventional heat source hotter than 50 degrees Celsius. Answer choice D. Milk that has been heated in a microwave oven does not taste noticeably different from milk that has been briefly heated by exposure to a conventional heat source. Answer choice E. Heating any liquid by microwave creates small zones within it that are much hotter than the overall temperature that the liquid will ultimately reach. Okay. So, aside from your interjection in the middle, that was pretty much the whole argument that we get. And so let's go back to the stimulus, because man, that's like I had to like pull back.
It's a good one. I know. I could feel your self-restraint.
Feel my pain.
Yeah.
Being not able to just jump in and start carving this one up. So there's a couple things that come out. You're talking about raw milk. It's like, whatever. Most everybody's had milk at some point in their life. So it's like, okay, great. But notice how that first sentence is really deep in terms of its complexity. There's a lot of information that they've thrown at you. So they take a cup of raw milk. What do they do to it? They heat it in a microwave oven to 50 degrees Celsius. And what happened? It contains half of its initial concentration of this enzyme. Now, do I care about this enzyme? Do I care that it's lysozyme in particular? No, because do they mention any other enzymes? No, throughout the rest of the problem, they just mention lysozyme. So I'm not going to get all caught up in this like scientific terminology and start thinking about lysozyme. And I'm not even, if you don't know what an enzyme is, does it matter?
Yeah, well, let me play kind of off your mentality when you read something like this, because I know you know what these words are, but let's say someone doesn't. Like, what would be your particular vision through this question if, let's say, you read the word enzyme and didn't know what it was, or you read lysozyme and didn't know how to pronounce it?
I would simply use it as a placeholder, this thing. And then I would see what they did with the thing.
Gotcha.
Now, from an expectation standpoint, with the LSAT, if it's not something that they consider to be common knowledge, they'll either explain it or it will not play an active role in the argument.
Yeah.
Literally, you could have said, it contains half of its initial concentration of contaminants. Not to say that an enzyme is a contaminant, but it could say anything.
Literally, it's a Mad Lib at that point. Throw your own word, whatever you want in there.
Half its initial concentration of color agent. Okay, fine.
Whatever you want.
It actually does not have a material effect on this problem as to what this is. It's just that in the case of the microwave, when they got it to 50 degrees, it had half of this enzyme. Yeah. And when they did it conventionally, it had all of its enzyme.
Well, we'll get to that. But so far, microwaves, 50 degrees, half the enzyme. Hold up? But it could just be, I mean, honestly, throw cow juice in there. It doesn't matter.
Isn't
anything.
Usually that's what we're talking about.
Well, milk, yeah. But that was on it when I read enzyme, lysozyme, and I was like, what could I replace that with? And just cow juice. That's what came to my mind.
That's a little circular, but whatever.
Well, okay, keep going.
So, anyway, you do it in a microwave, you get half of it. Now, what happens when you put it in a conventional heat source? And you do the same exact temperature, which we'll bring up in just a second. What happens to that concentration of enzyme stuff?
Nothing.
It stays pretty much 100%. Nearly all of its initial concentration. Now, I'm going to notice the nearly all just because it's obviously not 100%. But as it turns out, that's probably not the area of focus that I'm worried about. And that's because when I get to the conclusion here, that's where they really make the judgment. So you have this information, and what do we have so far? We know that we started off with raw milk, and we heated it to 50 degrees in both instances. So those two parameters, those two facts are the same.
Temperature's the same. The methodology is the difference, right?
Yeah, the methodology is different. Yeah. They used a microwave versus a conventional heat source. And then what was the difference, the other difference there?
The lysosome. Do you try to quantify the nearly all?
I'm not going to worry about it here unless I start to see answer choices or a conclusion that seems to play off the nearly all.
In other words, I just can envision someone listening to this and being like, what does nearly all mean as a number?
Almost all of it. I'm not going to try to quantify it because...
Perfect. So it's not 97%. There's no
It's relative.
Standardized. Okay. I agree with you. I didn't know if you had a thing where you were like, well, nearly all means 94.
What's nearly all of 100 versus nearly all of, say, 1,000,000?
3% less.
Okay, I don't even want to quantify it.
I'm not either.
It just doesn't.
I'm being obtuse. Yeah.
Perfect. You've self-described well.
No, it's...
Anyway, the nearly all doesn't play a big role to me because the conclusion doesn't seem to hinge upon that slightly missing amount.
Right. The conclusion or whatever is about to come seems to hinge on the fact that there is just a difference.
Well, the conclusion gives you two pieces of information. What destroys the enzyme and the reason why you've had this drop of, let's just say, half.
Let's do the conclusion.
It's not heat. That's the first thing to say. What destroys the enzyme is not heat. So that's the first fact, but instead it's microwaves. So the microwave heated version of the milk had 50% of the enzyme of the conventionally heated version of the milk. So they look at this and they're like, well, it's got to be that the microwave is what caused this lower enzyme concentration. So it's not heat, but the microwave. It's something that the microwaves do.
It's the source of heat, basically.
Yeah. It's where it's coming from, not the heat itself.
Yes.
So now you got to weaken that argument.
Is there anything else about this argument that stands out to you?
You clearly have something in mind, so.
Well, causality.
I'm so sorry.
Thought that might get a mention.
Gee, I do know that. Yeah, well, the last of the White Russians last night.
Let's rewind the
my
tape.
ability to think clearly. Yeah, well, it's clearly causal, right? I guess
I didn't mean
said
to stump you.
this causes this, and I thought that was enough, but apparently you need me to specify more. So yeah, this is the cause, is the nature of the heat source, and what's not the cause is the heat itself.
Yes.
So now there's an interesting reaction to this argument. Like when I read arguments of this nature, I typically think to myself, it's causal. There's going to be trouble here. There could be a lot of different things going on.
Trouble is, since you're just naturally more suspicious about causation?
I'm suspicious about anything on the LSAT just because so many of the arguments are flawed.
True that. But if you read a causal argument on the LSAT, it heightens your suspicion.
Yeah, which is an interesting point. If I read a causal conclusion, my suspicion is at the maximum level.
Agreed.
Not so much with a causal premise, because I know that they'll allow for that and then take that and use it in a valid conclusion. But a causal conclusion makes me very, very concerned. But a lot of times I've seen people read this question and they're like, that doesn't sound wrong. I mean, they use different heat sources and the enzyme was lower, so that would make sense as the cause.
Right.
So when you see a question that says which of the following would weaken the argument, that could be a little bit of a surprise. Mm-hmm. And we often talk about pre-phrasing argumentation. And, first you have to understand it clearly. This isn't an easy argument to pre-phrase.
Yeah, I agree with you.
You know there's something else going on that would explain this, but it's really hard to envision what it would actually be. So,
if you're a test taker doing this, what is your pre-phrase as best you could maybe, elucidate it? What would you be thinking in terms of expectations?
I'd probably keep it really broad and think to myself, there is something else at play here.
Yeah.
And try to keep an open mind as to what that might actually be.
We don't want it to be the microwave specifically. We want it to be something about this process that is otherwise influential.
I'm also aware of the fact that they were really adamant that it's not heat. So if I could possibly show that heat did play a role somehow, that might not be the worst thing in the world, but I'm going to have to watch that because it's going to have to be within the context of what they've said.
So you're thinking broadly like alternate cause. We outline, for instance, and you know this better than anyone, you wrote it, but we outline about the various processes by which you can weaken a causal argument. And there are certain things here that I think fail at the jump. You're not going to be able to reverse anything here, for instance.
No.
I don't think. I'd be shocked if you could be like, no, it's actually the lysozymes that... So that, to me, at least helps with the pre-phrase because it eliminates certain pathways of thought. When I look at this, I'm like, alternate cause.
That's the most obvious.
Yeah.
I want to see how this works, though, with that conclusion because they think it's microwaves, so I want to show something that's not the microwaves.
Sure.
So that's your alternate cause right there.
Perfect.
Let me ask you, how hard do you think this question is in terms of percentages?
Well, I know the answer to this, and it surprised me a little bit. Part of what surprised me, I think, the most, Dave, in this question is how often people chose a single wrong answer. That there's there's one wrong answer here that really grabbed folks, and I was less grabbed by it.
The reason I mention this is because I think from a review standpoint, this is the kind of data you want to access.
Yeah.
If I've done this question and I'm going through this on the review level, one of the things I want to do is I want to take a look at how other people did on the question. The statistics in our system, for example, are built upon thousands of users and largely reflect the difficulties that LSAC would see in a question. So when we say, as is the case with this question, that 56% of the students who used it in our system got it right, it's probably not too far off what the true reality is on the actual test.
If anything, I'd probably think it's actually less on the real thing. I'm going to give our students a hat tip. I think they're a little savvier than the typical LSAT.
Yeah, probably so.
Test taker out there. Yeah.
But 56%, that this is a tough question. You know, and part of it is it's got this science idea in the middle of it. Part of it is I think the correct answers can be a little bit challenging to understand in context. But this is the type of question where like it's a hard question. As it turns out, there's a wrong answer choice that really attracts people.
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure that I understand why people were attracted to that wrong answer, especially if I was one of the people who chose it. And then I'm going to look at the right answer too and think, boy, only 56% of the people chose this. How do I make sure that next time I get this right?
Right. This
So
is
the
a
first
standout
step-
moment. This is an opportunity.
Yeah.
I want to emphasize that point, though. Even if you didn't fall victim to this wrong answer choice that we'll talk about that's so attractive, apparently, to at least about a quarter of the people, this is one of those things you've got to understand what about it is appealing.
You can still know it.
Yeah.
And this is where we talk about the teacher mentality. If I'm about to teach this question to a class of 30 people, I want to make sure that I can explain not just each answer choice, but especially the answer choices that are most dangerous to students. So we still haven't revealed the right answer yet.
No,
We're
we've
going
actually
to.
been pretty coy. Let's do it.
You want to go through the answers, or you want
You're really rocking over there.
your throats?
You can tell
You're
how I'm
literally
feeling.
like, I can't talk. All right.
Sorry.
So let's
Carry
go to
me,
answer
Dave.
choice
Carry me
A.
home.
So this is said, heating raw milk in a microwave oven to a temperature of 100 degrees destroys all the lysozyme present in that milk. How do you feel about this one?
Well, heating it in a microwave destroys almost, but it doesn't serve to set up any kind of distinction between these two. To me and 93% of other people, this answer is not terribly appealing. It doesn't seem to present a different reason for the lysozyme.
It doesn't reinterpret the data,
Right.
which is what you really need in an answer choice like
That's a good way to
this.
say it.
Like I mentioned heat sources before, and they said it's not heat. This doesn't all of a sudden say that it's heat.
Yeah.
Everything we had before was about 50 degrees.
Yeah.
And just being heated.
that was going to
to
be my hinge point too. Is like you look at this 100 degrees. Well,
It's like, okay,
neither instance was heated to 100 degrees. Why would this answer choice be relevant?
if this said heating raw milk to 1,000 degrees destroys all of it, it wouldn't change anything.
do
It's just
anything
like, okay,
different
hot source wrecks things.
Yeah.
Okay, pretty simple.
Right. So if the stimulus is about 50 and this is about 100, you've already missed the mark.
Still, though, 7% of the test takers selected this, and you were like, that's not a lot. That actually, to me, is very high. Because I'm like, the only explanation is they saw heat, and they're like, if you keep on heating it with that, you see that it all destroys. But all that tells me is, okay, the microwaves were consistent as they went up in temperature. They just destroyed more and
It's
more.
the second worst answer choice. Let's not give it too much credit.
Okay.
Statistically.
I'm not getting a huge amount out of it other than, hey, we had two scenarios with 50 degrees. Now we've got 100. I don't really like that. All right, how about B? Enzymes in raw milk that are destroyed through excessive heating can be replaced by adding them from other sources.
You know what shocks me is that this one actually attracted more people than A.
Yep, 8%.
Yeah. I mean, 1% more, but this to me is I would think, patently more obvious wrong answer.
It doesn't even talk about, the heat. Here we're talking about the loss of enzymes and their replacement.
There's no why in this answer choice, which is clearly what we need. Why? Why would the microwave be different if it's not the microwave itself?
It's a universal answer. It applies on both sides of the microwave conventional heat source scenario, and that's not going to explain how there's a difference here in the enzymes. So that universality, I'm like, yeah, that applies at all times. Who cares? And there's no real info to address what you were just talking about, like with the microwaves. It's
Why?
like, this doesn't even tell us anything. Hey, guys, we can get enzymes from someplace else.
Let's throw them back in there.
Okay,
That's
man.
great if you're, in the market for enzymes.
If I'm a milk manufacturer who's heating milk and pasteurizing stuff, well, then this is the kind of thing that I need to know.
I guess. I mean,
Why?
who really wants that much lysozyme?
I don't know,
Doesn't that
dude.
sound
I don't
gross?
know what lysozyme actually is other than an
Sounds
enzyme.
gross, right? All right.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure it's useful and they want to throw it back in, but it almost is like the too sciencey answer, like, oh, you can actually replace it. And it's like, well, mate,
Yeah, Louis Pasteur's doing backflips, but it doesn't matter.
Maybe they're thinking that, hey, you can actually manipulate the levels when it's all said and done.
Let's get to a heavy hitter.
You want to get to C, you don't like B?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I could have gone off on B for a while longer.
All right.
Let's go to C. A liquid exposed to a conventional heat source of exactly 50 degrees Celsius, and there's our 50, will reach that temperature more slowly than it would if it were exposed to a conventional heat source hotter than 50 degrees Celsius.
I've heard you explain this question to people before, and I always liked your explanation about C. Largely, I think both of our suspicions are that C attracts people because, well, duh.
It's true.
Yeah. Yeah, the hotter the heat source is, the faster it heats things up.
Yeah,
but,
if you want to boil water, you just don't keep it on lukewarm the whole time.
Yeah.
You start smashing the heat up higher and higher. So you read this, and your initial reaction is, this is in fact the case.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Is the fact that it's true in the real world, largely, does that make it the right answer?
Here's what I love so much about weaken and strengthen questions is you're guaranteed that it's true before you read it.
True,
you can see that right up top. Which of the following if true? So C's a guarantee, even if in real world terms, it makes no physical sense.
You know, it resonates more strongly with people when it's like they know it to be the case in their lives.
But does it have anything to do with explaining the difference differently that we see in the stimulus? Does it give an alternative reason that lysozyme reduction is changed in a microwave versus elsewhere? No.
It doesn't even talk about the microwave.
Doesn't touch it.
This is conventional heat source heated to 50 degrees by a 50-degree source versus heated to, by a hotter source.
We need there to be something about a microwave source that is different that isn't the microwave itself.
And we didn't really know anything about hotter sources. All we know is that these liquids were heated to 50 degrees. The exact nature of it is limited to one's microwave and one's conventional.
Yeah. You want the big reveal? How many people picked this answer?
How many?
23%.
So that's your quarter.
That is crazy.
Almost quarter.
Like statistically, this answer is more popular than a blind guess.
When you put it that way, it's kind of harsh. But if you were to do this question and you've chosen answer choice C, you now need to sit down and think, why did this attract me?
Yeah. Even if you lingered on answer choice C, what about that got my attention in the first place? Again, I think people give themselves, this is kind of that ranking thing I was saying before, people give themselves, honestly, not enough credit in terms of just where their attention goes. Yeah, it ended up okay, but like, what about C even grabbed you for a minute?
Well, you know what they're thinking. They're looking at the way the conventional heat source basically retained all of its enzyme, and they're like, well, maybe this has something to do with the speed in which it was heated.
You know what C feels like to me? It feels like someone trying to make an answer work.
They are, because it doesn't say that is relevant, but they suggest, hey, maybe you should think about this particular factor.
Yeah.
They do that all the time. Yeah. And a lot of times it's really easy to be like, no, that's an irrelevant thing.
Yeah.
Like the 100 degrees that we saw in answer choice A, or the replacement of enzymes we see in B. This idea of the speed of it, you haven't been given enough information to make a judgment as to whether or not this is useful to, well, you know it's not useful, but whether it would be good enough to give you an alternate scenario here.
So for you out there listening to this, stop fighting for answers. Fight against answers.
Don't read into them. Yeah, look to kill them, not to give them life support.
Machete.
The truth is that if you find yourself arguing for an answer, it's usually wrong.
Yeah, dude. If you got to justify it to yourself, you're in a bad spot.
And then if you're doing that, then what we can say is this.
There's the sound effect. Oh, God.
Yeah, C is wrong. All right, let's go to D. Okay. Milk that has been heated in a microwave oven does not taste noticeably different from... Look, I can't read the rest of this.
That's enough.
Come on.
This is the least popular.
This is the least popular at 5%. This is what the marketing department wants to think about. Well, did it change the flavor and all that? It is not relevant to what we have, which you now know that E is the correct answer. Yes, and this is the 56% answer. So let's go through it one more time. Heating any liquid by microwave. All right, so now we're talking about what's going on with the microwave. Creates small zones within it that are much hotter than the overall temperature that the liquid will ultimately reach.
Let's break this down piece by piece. Heating any liquid, I think a lot of people would maybe be thrown off by the fact that that doesn't necessarily seem to apply to milk.
Good point.
And yet, categorically, it must. It's an umbrella term.
That is correct. If you say something about cats in general, it applies to all black cats.
There you go. Which is actually, funny enough, a thing we've seen them do. Mm-hmm. He's a licensed accountant. He's an accountant.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a curve there where they're like heating any liquid. Hey, this isn't about milk.
But notice how it applies. Any liquid heated by microwave. Is that part of what we were just... Yeah, that actually is discussed up there. Milk by microwave. And what does it do? You get these little zones, these little pockets of extreme heat. And there's your alternate cause. It's not the microwave itself. It's the fact that you get these little, bubbles of extreme temperature.
It's the nature of the source and how it actually heats up the liquid. Yeah. Those bubbles then are destroying the enzymes. So when they set up above, it's not heat but microwaves. Right. That's not what the microwaves are doing. It's the nature of how a microwave oven actually works. Yeah. And
it is the heat, as it turns out, which is what he tells you. It is the heat. Microwaves heat things differently.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that to me is just a beautiful question.
Well, you think about it from a review standpoint, you notice these little things like, all right, would I have been tripped up by the any liquid? And did I really understand like these little small zones, small pockets idea? I don't know. But when you're reviewing, that's where you stop and you say, what did I see during the test? How did it affect me or not affect me? If you got this right, maybe you're like, that wasn't an issue for me. I'm good. You're comfortable, you move on. But if you miss this, you might go back and think, that actually did throw me off. I can't just assume because they didn't say milk that this is wrong, because a lot of times people will do that. They're like, well, they didn't talk about it. I'm like, they're talking about it with the umbrella, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Part of what I like about this answer choice so much, and something you and I have seen more times than we could count, is how well it speaks to the importance of focusing on a conclusion. If you really focus on this conclusion, which is at the end, what destroys the enzyme is not heat but microwaves. It's like, does this talk about heat versus microwaves? Yes, it does. Does this conclusion deal with milk? Not really. I mean, obviously it's part of it, but this to me is a great example of if you really are dialed in on conclusions themselves, you're giving yourself an advantage, and weaken and strengthen.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, strengthen being a question type we talked about as one of the top 4.
All right, so just a good example of how we review these types of questions and the types of things that we can learn from them. Mm-hmm. I'll close out the general review discussion in the 2 weeks by pointing something out about life balance, which is this, is the last 2 weeks are really easy to kind of get overly focused on the test and to try to figure, where things are going and to lose focus on the rest of your life. You can't allow that to happen. You need to take some personal time during this period, even if it's just to go out to dinner or have, have lunch with a friend. You've got to get outside the LSAT for just a few minutes. You need downtime mentally. This has been proven repeatedly. Now, contrary to how John and I spent
because you know where this is going.
How we spent our weekend, you should probably slow down on alcohol. That has a lingering knock-on effect that they have shown.
Don't go to dinner with us.
That that can last 7 to 14 days. And I think there's one study that lasted up to 20 days of a minor effect on cognitive ability. So the effects linger, and I'm sure that's the case with drugs as well. So, if you smoke weed every day, slow down. If you drink a bottle of wine every day, slow down. I'm not saying you have to give those things up entirely.
Or call me. Whatever.
Call you.
Either way.
I still think balance is really important, but maybe not at the same intensity or rate.
This is probably a good stretch to dry out.
Yeah, just a little bit.
I was talking to you.
For me, I'm not going to look at another bottle of anything for a month. And if you're in school, and not everybody is, but if you are in, don't forget you cannot sacrifice your grades just to study for this test.
True that.
It's easy to want to and think this is more important, and I understand why you would think that, but you don't want to give up the grades that you've had or worked so hard for at this point. So, and the last thing is, if you're going to give up alcohol or any drugs that you might be taking, focus on your nutrition and exercise. Keep yourself like healthy and feeling good. If you drink a lot of coffee, cut it back just slightly.
Yeah.
Not to the point where you start getting headaches, but eat better. Don't eat a lot of heavy foods. Try to focus on being lean and mean, both mentally and physically, simply so that when you get into the test, you're as clear-headed as possible. That supports that test mentality point that we've been going through. That's and is really kind of like part of the framework. You need to make sure that from a mental standpoint, you feel really good. You need to do that from a physical and nutritional standpoint, and that gives you that balance that allows you to set yourself up to study as well as possible and then to perform as well as possible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Would you say, Dave, that if anyone listening to this ever starts to sound like you or me, that it's a warning sign?
No, it's a great thing.
It's a great thing. All right.
I used to have a student that would tape the lectures that I did in class.
Yeah.
And then she would go to sleep listening to them at night.
Oh, look at you putting people to sleep.
I do that constantly. Why would this be any different?
That's fantastic.
It got to the point where her boyfriend was thinking that we were having some type of affair.
Oh, really?
And she's like, all you do is listen to this guy. And he listened to some of it, and he's like, they're just talking about the LSAT. What's really like, going on?
No. He's just human chloroform.
I am a narcotic.
There you go.
So, yeah, if you start to sound like, and to her credit, by the way, you can laugh about her performance. She got into the 160s, ended up at a T14 school. And this was a person who came from, was she 139 or 141?
Yeah, there you go.
She was way down, but she committed and she studied for a long time. She is an outlier in terms of performance, but I still remember when she was getting towards the end, we'd be in class and she repeated the class. And she would ask questions, and I would think to myself, that's exactly what I was just about to say.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That brings this full circle. If you start sounding like us, it's usually a pretty good thing.
I don't know if that's full circle.
That's a pretty good circle.
Yeah. All right. So I feel like in the grand scheme of things, that covers a lot. One of my favorite moments tonight has been this question review. It's so important that people understand the value that is inherent to these questions. And again, that gets back to the quality over quantity discussion.
Agreed. The big takeaway here is to just control the environment that you have for studying, to not get too obsessed, to check yourself both by the tests that you've taken in the past and the materials that you have, to make sure that every minute that you spend is as high quality as it possibly can be.
And sometimes as non-LSAT as it can be, which is something you just brought up. Like, step away from it, honestly.
Agreed. All right. That brings us to the end of our discussion here.
Yeah, on that dismissive note.
I want to thank everybody for listening. And if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and or YouTube. And give us a rating. That would be awesome. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com or lsat@powerscore.com. We're actually going to do a mailbag episode in the relatively near future. So if you would like us to address some topics, send them our way, and we'd be happy to include those as well. So thanks, everybody. We really appreciate it.